Welcome to the American Gazetteer. Tonight, we turn the pages of history back to the eastern edge of Wisconsin, where Milwaukee County lay beside the inland sea of Lake Michigan, its fields and waterways shaped by patient labor and older ice. Here, the land had rested long before it was measured, and when it was at last described in county atlases and gazette volumes, it was spoken of with a restrained admiration, as ground both obliging and exacting, generous yet requiring steady hands. Milwaukee County had been bounded to the east by the Great Lake, whose presence defined not only the horizon, but the temper of the soil and the air. To the north lay Ozaukee County, to the west Waukesha, and to the south Racine, though these lines were not always felt as firm divisions by those who worked the land, for farms and kinships often reached beyond surveyed borders. The county's shape, modest in breadth yet rich in variation, had been traced in careful ink upon plat maps, where each township appeared as a quiet square, awaiting the story of its settlement. The soil of Milwaukee County was commonly described in agricultural reports as loam of a dark and fertile character, resting upon clay and limestone. In the western townships, the ground was gently rolling, broken by low ridges left by ancient glacial movement, while nearer the lake, the land sloped more evenly, allowing water to travel with deliberation toward the shore. Farmers noted that wheat took well to these fields in earlier decades, followed by oats, barley, and Indian corn, while kitchen gardens near the homestead yielded cabbages, onions, and beans in dependable measure. Stone was never far beneath the surface. Limestone quarries were opened where outcroppings allowed, and their pale blocks were drawn by wagon to build foundations, cellars, and public works. The presence of this stone gave the county a quiet solidity, felt in the coolness of basements and the endurance of mills that stood firm beside flowing water. Clay beds, too, were worked for brick, their products finding their way into chimneys and modest dwellings that dotted the countryside. Water defined the county as surely as soil. The Milwaukee River entered from the north, winding southward through meadows and wooded banks before reaching the lake. Along its course, smaller streams joined it, their names appearing with gentle regularity in local records. The Menominee, broad and steady. The Kinnickinnick, shorter and swifter. And the Root River, which touched the southern portion of the county before continuing toward Racine. These waterways were not merely features of the map, but working companions to daily life, turning mill wheels, watering stock, and carrying the sound of frogs and night birds into open windows. The Menominee Valley, in particular, was remarked upon for its breadth and richness. Early descriptions spoke of grasses growing tall in the low ground, making it suitable for pasturage, while the higher banks were taken up by farms whose barns faced the water. It was along these banks that surnames such as Bauer, Schmidt, and Mueller appeared with frequency in census schedules, their holders engaged in dairying and mixed husbandry, rising early to the sound of cattle and the distant rush of the stream. Woodlands once covered much of the county, especially along rivers and in low-lying areas. Oak openings were common, their widely spaced trees allowing sunlight to reach the ground, while stands of maple, elm, and basswood grew thicker near watercourses. These woods provided fuel, fencing, and building material, and they shaped the rhythms of labor. For winter cutting and spring hauling were tasks understood by nearly every household. Names such as Johnson, Larson, and Anderson were found among those who cleared land in the northern townships, their Scandinavian origins quietly reflected in the careful order of their fields. The air of Milwaukee County was often described as tempered by the lake. Summers were cooler near the shore, winters somewhat softened, though never gentle. Lake winds carried moisture inland, bringing fog in spring and heavy snow in winter. Farmers learned to read these signs, to judge planting by the feel of the breeze and the look of the sky over the water. In diaries and letters, one finds mention of sudden storms rising from the east, their approach marked by a darkening line upon the lake and a hush among birds. The shoreline itself was varied, with bluffs rising in places and low beaches in others. Harbors were formed where rivers met the lake, their mouths shifting with sand and season. Before extensive improvement, these natural harbors required constant attention, for ice and silt altered them year by year. Yet it was here that the county met the wider world, through the movement of grain, lumber, and people, all carried by sail and later by steam. Inland, the land was divided into townships such as Wauwatosa, Greenfield, Lake, and Granville, their boundaries drawn with precision, yet softened by daily use. Roads followed section lines, often little more than graded earth, bordered by ditches and young trees. In spring, these roads were known for their mud, in summer for their dust, and in winter for their hard, rutted snow. Travel was measured, and distance was felt, not in miles alone, but in hours and effort. Creeks and minor runs, some unnamed in larger works yet known well to neighbors, crossed these roads at shallow fords or by simple plank bridges. Children learned their depths by wading, teamsters by careful crossing, and in times of flood they were spoken of with respect. Such waters shaped the placement of schools, churches, and farms, for no household wished to be cut off entirely when the snow melted or the rains came. The natural setting of Milwaukee County thus formed a quiet partnership with those who settled it. The land did not yield itself all at once, nor did it resist beyond reason. It asked for clearing, draining, fencing, and patience, and in return it offered steadiness. Census figures from mid-century records suggested a population growing from a few thousand souls to many tens of thousands by century's end, though such numbers, written in ink, could never fully express the lived experience of scattered farmsteads, river valleys, and lake winds. As evening settled over the county, the geography revealed itself not as lines and measures, but as sound and scent. Water moved steadily in the dark, leaves stirred in the lake breeze, and the earth held the day's warmth. These elements, unchanged in their nature, bore witness to generations who worked, rested, and passed on, leaving their names upon the land in deeds and memories rather than stone. In this setting, before streets were fully laid and institutions firmly established, the county existed first as ground, water, and sky, patiently awaiting the lives that would give it further definition. It was a place shaped as much by what endured as by what was built, and its geography remained the quiet foundation upon which all else was raised. Milwaukee, the county seat, had risen where river and lake met, its position long favored by geography before it was confirmed by charter and record. The meeting of the Milwaukee River with Lake Michigan created a natural point of exchange, and from this confluence the town grew with a measured confidence, shaped by commerce yet tempered by the steady habits of its residents. In county histories, printed toward the close of the century, the place was described not as sudden or reckless in its expansion, but as deliberate, built course by course like the stone foundations that supported its earliest structures. The streets of the town were laid out in a pattern that reflected both ambition and restraint. Broad thoroughfares extended inland from the harbor, while narrower streets followed the curves of the river and the practical needs of trade. Many were first graded earth, later improved with plank or stone, their surfaces bearing the marks of wagons loaded with flour, lumber, and barreled goods. Along these streets stood buildings of brick and limestone, their proportions solid rather than ornate, suggesting permanence over display. Public buildings occupied places of quiet prominence. The courthouse, built of local stone, stood as both a practical center and a symbol of order, its steps worn by the measured passage of lawyers, farmers, and petitioners from surrounding townships. Nearby, offices of record held deeds, wills, and tax rolls, their shelves lined with volumes whose spines bore the names of families now woven into the county's history. Names such as Walker, Juneau, and Wells appeared frequently in early accounts, associated with land claims, mercantile ventures, and civic responsibility. Banks were established with careful formality, their presence marking Milwaukee's role as a financial center for the county. These institutions occupied stout buildings with restrained facades, their interiors fitted with counters of polished wood and iron safes set deep into masonry walls. Farmers from Wauwatosa or Greenfield arrived by wagon to deposit earnings from grain or livestock, while mill owners arranged credit for repairs and expansion. Trust, built slowly through familiarity, was as valuable as coin, and it was sustained by repeated dealings and shared reputation. Churches rose among the commercial blocks, their steeples visible above rooftops and masts. Congregations reflected the varied origins of the population, with services conducted in English and German alike. On Sundays, streets that were busy with trade during the week took on a quieter aspect, as families walked from their homes to worship, their pace unhurried, their conversation subdued. The sound of bells carried across the river, mingling with the creak of docked vessels and the distant wash of the lake. Commercial life centered near the harbor and along the riverbanks. Warehouses lined the water, their doors opening to receive grain sacks, hides, and timber. Mills driven by water power drawn from the river and its raceways ground wheat into flour that bore the county's name to distant markets. The air in these districts carried the mingled scents of grain dust, fresh-cut wood, and lake water, a combination noted often in travelers' descriptions. Residential streets extended away from this bustle, their houses set back behind small yards. Many dwellings were modest in scale, built for practicality, with porches facing the street and gardens at the rear. Here lived clerks, craftsmen, and laborers, their days structured by the regular hours of work and the changing seasons. In census schedules, surnames such as Kruger, Pabst, and Uihlein appeared among those engaged in brewing and related trades, industries that drew upon the county's grain and clean water. The river itself served as both boundary and connector. Bridges spanned it at intervals, first of wood and later of iron, allowing traffic to move between east and west portions of the town. These crossings were places of constant motion, where pedestrians paused to watch boats pass below, their masts and rigging briefly framed by the structure overhead. In winter, when ice formed thick upon the water, crossings shifted to the frozen surface, and sleigh bells replaced the sound of oars. Education and print found early footing in the county seat. Schools were established to serve the growing population, their rooms simple yet orderly, furnished with benches, slate boards, and maps that showed the wider world beyond the lake. Newspapers were printed regularly, their presses housed in brick buildings whose windows glowed late into the evening. These papers recorded shipping arrivals, market prices, and local affairs, preserving for later readers the texture of daily life. The harbor remained the town's defining feature. Ships arrived bearing goods and departed laden with produce, their schedules governed by season and weather. In spring, the opening of navigation was awaited with anticipation, while in autumn, the last departures marked the approach of winter quiet. Sailors, merchants, and dock workers moved through the streets, their presence lending the town an air of connection to distant places, even as most residents lived within a familiar circuit of home, work, and church. Milwaukee's role as county seat thus combined administration, commerce, and community. It was not merely the location of offices and courts, but a gathering point where rural and urban life met. Farmers arrived with produce and news from the countryside. Townspeople listened and exchanged their own accounts of market and harbor. In this exchange, the county found a sense of cohesion, anchored by the town yet extending outward along roads and rivers. As evening fell, lamps were lit along the streets, their glow reflected in shop windows and on the river's surface. The day's commerce gave way to quieter pursuits, and the town settled into rest. From the harbor came the soft sounds of water against hulls, while inland, the steady rhythm of domestic life continued behind closed doors. Milwaukee, as the seat of county affairs, stood then, as it had throughout the century, a place defined by its setting and sustained by the measured industry of its people. North of the county seat, the land rose gently away from the lake and river mouths, unfolding into townships whose character was shaped more by fields than by wharves. These northern districts were recorded in atlases with measured clarity, yet their true nature was known best through daily use, by the feel of soil turned by plow and the sound of wind moving through grain. Granville, Brown Deer, and portions of what was later called Lake Township appeared in early records as places of steady settlement, neither remote nor hurried, their growth marked by patient improvement rather than spectacle. The farms of these townships were commonly of moderate size, laid out along section lines, with houses set near the road and barns drawn back for shelter. Fields stretched behind them in long rectangles, planted according to custom and season. Wheat had been favored in earlier decades, followed by oats and hay, and later by dairying, which suited the grasslands and the proximity to market. In agricultural schedules, names such as Schultz, Peterson, and Hoffman appeared beside notations of acreage and stock, suggesting households where labor was shared among family members and measured by daylight. Watercourses, smaller than the county's principal rivers, yet no less essential, crossed these lands with quiet persistence. Creeks fed by springs ran through meadows and woodlots, providing reliable water for cattle and modest power for small mills. These streams were often known locally by descriptive names, remembered within families and neighborhoods, even when not widely printed. Along their banks, children learned to fish, and men set simple footbridges of plank and log, renewing them as needed after spring thaw. Homesteads were built with attention to durability. Foundations of fieldstone supported walls of timber or brick, and roofs were pitched to shed snow. Interiors were plain, furnished with tables worn smooth by use, cupboards holding crockery, and stoves that served as the heart of the house. Evenings were spent in measured quiet, with reading, mending, or conversation, the outside world marked by the distant call of animals and the steady chorus of insects in warmer months. Churches and schoolhouses stood at intervals along the roads, their presence anchoring community life. The schoolhouse, often a single room, was a place where children of varying ages gathered, their lessons conducted under the watchful eye of a teacher whose name appeared briefly in records, yet remained long in memory. Churches hosted not only worship, but meetings and seasonal gatherings, drawing families together and reinforcing bonds that extended beyond immediate kin. Roads in the northern townships were quieter than those nearer the seat, yet they bore the marks of regular use. Wagons traveled them at a steady pace, carrying produce southward and returning with goods and news. In winter, sleigh tracks replaced wheel ruts, and travel took on a muffled quality, sound softened by snow. These roads connected households not only to markets, but to one another, sustaining a sense of shared circumstance. It is fitting, at this gentle pause in our account, to reflect together. As you listen, you might consider the place from which you now hear these words, and how your own ground, whether familiar or newly settled, holds traces of those who came before. Should you wish, you may quietly leave a note of where you listen from, adding your own thread to this long fabric of local memory. And if you remain with the American Gazetteer, you do so not as a mere listener, but as a steward, helping such recollections endure beyond a single telling. Woodlots remained an important feature of these townships. Families managed them carefully, cutting fuel in winter and allowing regrowth in other seasons. Maple trees were tapped in early spring, their sap boiled down in iron kettles, a task that brought neighbors together and marked the turning of the year. These practices, noted in passing in local histories, formed part of a cycle understood without need of record. Population figures for the northern townships, drawn from census returns, suggested gradual increase rather than sudden influx. Households were added as land was divided among sons or sold to new arrivals, and barns were expanded as herds grew. Yet the overall impression remained one of balance, with land and labor kept in proportion. The countryside retained open spaces, and the horizon was defined by tree lines and distant farmsteads rather than dense construction. By evening, the northern townships settled into a deep quiet. Smoke rose straight from chimneys when the air was still, and lamps were lit one by one inside houses set far apart. From fields came the low sounds of animals, and from beyond them the faint murmur of wind through grass and leaves. These were the enduring sounds of the county's interior, unchanged in their essence, even as generations passed. Thus, the northern townships contributed to the county not through prominence, but through constancy. Their fields fed markets, their families filled churches and schools, and their steady rhythms underpinned the more visible life of town and harbor. They stood as a reminder that much of history was made quietly, in places where the land itself set the pace. South of the county seat, the land extended in a measured descent toward the boundary with Racine County, its character shaped by long roads, open fields, and the steady cooperation of neighboring households. These southern townships, including Greenfield, Lake, and portions of Oak Creek as they were described in later local histories, were neither isolated nor hurried. They formed a broad agricultural belt, tied closely to the markets of Milwaukee, yet governed in daily life by the demands of soil, weather, and stock. The roads of the southern townships were among their most defining features. Drawn straight along section lines where possible, they stretched across fields and through low ground, bordered by fences of rail or wire. These thoroughfares bore constant but unremarkable traffic. Wagons loaded with milk cans at dawn, teams hauling hay in summer, and sleds moving quietly over snow in winter. In township records, road maintenance was a frequent subject, reflecting the shared understanding that these paths were essential to both commerce and community. Farms in these districts were often devoted to mixed husbandry. Fields of grain lay beside pasture, and barns were arranged to accommodate both crops and cattle. Dairying, in particular, became increasingly prominent, supported by the reliable grasses of the region and the proximity to urban demand. Census schedules from the period recorded households with modest herds, their owners rising before first light to milk, feed, and prepare for the day's work. Surnames such as Kowalski, Zielinski, and Nowak appeared with growing frequency, reflecting arrivals from Eastern Europe who adapted quickly to the rhythms of the land. Water remained an organizing element, though here it often took the form of smaller streams and marshy stretches rather than broad rivers. The Root River touched the southern edge of the county, while tributary creeks wound through meadows, sometimes requiring drainage to render fields fully workable. Ditches were cut by hand, their maintenance a recurring task that drew neighbors together in seasonal labor, each household contributing time and effort to improvements that benefited all. The social life of the southern townships was closely tied to work done in common. Barn raisings were occasions of practical necessity and quiet fellowship, with timbers lifted into place by many hands and meals provided by the hosting family. Harvests, too, were shared endeavors, particularly when weather threatened delay. These gatherings were rarely described in detail in official histories, yet they were implied in the steady progress of farms that could not have been managed by single families alone. Churches and halls served as focal points beyond the farmyard. In these buildings, constructed of wood or brick, meetings were held to discuss roads, schools, and matters of mutual concern. Services were conducted in languages familiar to the congregation, and hymn singing carried out across surrounding fields on still days. Such institutions provided continuity, offering a rhythm of gathering that balanced the solitude of farm work. The landscape itself bore the marks of careful use. Windbreaks of trees were planted along field edges, ponds were dug to water stock, and fences were repaired season after season. These improvements were incremental, often unnoticed by those who made them, yet together they shaped a countryside that appeared orderly and composed. Travelers passing through remarked upon the neatness of farms and the evident pride taken in their upkeep. As evening approached, the southern townships grew quiet, in a manner distinct from both town and more remote countryside. Lamps were lit early, for mornings came soon, and families gathered indoors while the last tasks of the day were completed outside. The sound of wagons faded along the roads, replaced by the steady presence of wind and the distant lowing of cattle. Population in these townships increased at a measured pace, shaped by family growth and selective settlement rather than rapid influx. Land changed hands within extended families or through local agreement, and new houses appeared gradually along established roads. The result was a landscape that felt settled without being crowded, its openness preserved even as productivity increased. The southern townships thus formed a steady counterbalance within the county. They were defined less by singular landmarks than by continuity of effort, by roads kept passable, fields kept fertile, and relationships maintained through shared responsibility. Their contribution lay not in distinction, but in reliability, sustaining both the county seat to the north and neighboring districts beyond the border. When night settled fully, the countryside rested. Roads lay empty beneath the stars. Barns stood dark and still, and the land itself seemed to draw breath. In such moments, the southern townships revealed their enduring nature, shaped by work repeated over years and shared quietly among neighbors. Across Milwaukee County, wherever water moved with steadiness and fall, human industry gathered beside it. The county's rivers and creeks, already shaped by time and terrain, were adapted with care to serve the needs of milling and manufacture. These enterprises were seldom loud in their ambition, yet they were constant in their presence, providing the quiet, mechanical pulse that supported both town and countryside. Along the Milwaukee River, mills had been established early, their placement determined by natural bends and modest drops in elevation. Timber-framed structures rose near the banks, their wheels turning with the river's flow, day and night when conditions allowed. Grain brought in from surrounding farms was ground into flour, its quality noted in market reports, and sought by bakers both local and distant. Families such as the Hubbles and Richards appeared in early milling records associated with operations that combined practical skill with careful stewardship of water rights. The Menominee River, broader and slower in its course, supported a cluster of mills that took advantage of its dependable flow. Here, sawmills worked timber drawn from upriver, cutting logs into boards that were stacked to season in open yards. The sound of sawing carried across the valley, mingling with the calls of workers and the rush of water through sluices. These mills supplied lumber for barns, houses, bridges, and workshops throughout the county, their output shaping the built environment as surely as stone and brick. Smaller streams, including the Kinnickinnick and lesser runs, powered modest enterprises whose scale matched their setting. Blacksmith shops were often found nearby, their forges lit before dawn, and their anvils ringing in measured cadence. Smiths repaired plows, shod horses, and fashioned hardware essential to farm and household. Names such as Meyer, O'Connell, and Novak appeared in trade directories, associated with shops where skill was passed from hand to hand and year to year. Workshops clustered near mills, forming small industrial neighborhoods without formal designation. Coopering sheds produced barrels for flour and produce, while tanneries processed hides brought in from farms, their presence noted by distinctive odors carried on the wind. These activities were regulated by custom and proximity, with care taken to place certain trades downstream or downwind, reflecting an understanding of shared space and necessity. Water management was a matter of constant attention. Dams required maintenance, raceways needed clearing, and seasonal fluctuations demanded adjustment. Spring floods could damage structures, while summer droughts reduced output. Mill owners and farmers alike understood these uncertainties, adapting schedules and expectations accordingly. Disputes over water use did arise, as recorded in court proceedings, yet they were typically resolved with reference to established rights and practical compromise. The presence of mills shaped daily rhythms. Wagons arrived in the morning loaded with grain or logs and departed later in the day, their drivers often waiting patiently while work was completed. These pauses created informal meeting places where news was exchanged and arrangements made. In this way, mills served not only as centers of production, but as points of social connection, linking scattered farms through shared dependence. As evening approached, activity slowed. Wheels turned more quietly, fires were banked, and workers returned to their homes. The buildings remained, silhouetted against fading light, their forms reflected in still water. Even at rest, they suggested readiness, poised to resume their work with the next day's flow. These mills and workshops represented an intermediate world between field and market. They transformed raw produce into usable goods, extending the value of farm labor and anchoring economic life within the county. Though modest in scale when compared to larger centers elsewhere, their cumulative effect was substantial, sustaining livelihoods and reinforcing the county's self-reliance. By night, the sound of water continued, indifferent to human schedules. Rivers flowed past darkened mills, carrying with them the day's work and the promise of the next. In this enduring movement lay the foundation of industry as it was practiced here, patient, responsive, and deeply tied to place. Thus, the work of water shaped Milwaukee County in ways both visible and subtle. It carved valleys, turned wheels, and gathered people into patterns of cooperation that endured across decades. The mills stood as witnesses to this relationship, their presence marking points where natural force and human intent met in lasting accord. Beyond field, mill, and market, the enduring fabric of Milwaukee County was woven within its churches and schools, institutions that ordered time and memory with a quiet authority. These places were neither ornamental nor imposing in their earliest forms, yet they carried weight beyond their materials, shaping habits of thought and conduct that endured across generations. In local histories, they were often described briefly, yet their influence was felt daily, guiding the rhythms of work, rest, and learning. Churches were among the first permanent structures raised in both town and countryside. Constructed of timber or brick, they stood at crossroads or on slight elevations, their placement chosen as much for accessibility as for visibility. Congregations gathered according to shared language and custom, with services conducted in English, German, and other tongues familiar to those who had come from distant shores. Ministers traveled circuits in early years, their arrival anticipated, their sermons remembered long after the sound of their voices had faded. Attendance was shaped by season and weather. In winter, travel was more difficult, and congregations were smaller, yet those who came did so with resolve. In summer, doors and windows stood open, allowing light and air to move freely through the space. Hymn singing, unaccompanied or supported by a simple organ, carried outward, blending with the sounds of the countryside. These moments marked the passage of weeks and years, providing continuity amid change. Schools, like churches, were established with practicality in mind. The earliest were simple structures, one room serving many grades, furnished with benches, desks, and a stove that required constant tending in cold months. Instruction emphasized reading, writing, and arithmetic, with geography and history introduced as means of understanding the wider world. Textbooks were shared, and slates bore the marks of repeated use. Teachers were often young, their tenure brief, yet their influence lasting, remembered in family accounts and marginal notes. These institutions fostered connections that extended beyond instruction and worship. Meetings were held to discuss local matters, elections conducted, and celebrations observed. Seasonal gatherings, tied to harvest or holiday, brought together households that otherwise met only in passing. Through such occasions, a sense of shared responsibility was cultivated, reinforcing ties among neighbors whose daily work kept them largely apart. Records from school boards and church councils reveal careful attention to order and improvement. Repairs were noted, funds collected, and decisions recorded with measured language. Names such as Fisher, McCormick, and Lindgren appeared in these minutes, associated with roles of stewardship rather than prominence. Service was understood as a duty, undertaken without expectation of lasting recognition. As the county grew, some congregations expanded, replacing earlier buildings with larger ones of brick or stone. Yet even as structures changed, customs remained familiar. Bells continued to mark hours of gathering, and the school day followed a pattern understood by all. Children carried lessons home, reciting passages by lamplight, while adults reflected upon sermons during the quiet of evening chores. In these settings, values were transmitted not through proclamation alone, but through repetition and example. Attendance, punctuality, and care for shared property were lessons learned alongside letters and numbers. Such habits shaped the character of the county as surely as its roads and fields, instilling a sense of continuity that bridged generations. By evening, these buildings returned to stillness. Schoolhouses stood empty, their doors closed against night air, while churches rested between services, their interiors dim and quiet. Yet their presence remained felt, for they had ordered the day and would do so again. In their silence lay the promise of return, a rhythm as dependable as the seasons. Thus, through churches and schools, Milwaukee County sustained a shared life that extended beyond individual households. These institutions provided structure without force, guidance without excess, and memory without monument. They stood as quiet anchors, holding fast amid the slow changes of land and labor. Within the farmhouses and town dwellings of Milwaukee County, daily life unfolded with a quiet regularity that seldom found its way into formal record, yet shaped the character of the county as surely as any public institution. These homes, whether set along a village street or at the end of a long lane, were built to shelter work as much as rest. Their rooms arranged to serve the practical needs of families whose days were full and whose nights were brief. Most houses followed familiar forms, their plans adapted from patterns brought by settlers and adjusted to local materials. Timber frames were common in earlier years, later joined by brick and stone construction where means allowed. Roofs were steep enough to shed snow, windows placed to admit light without undue loss of warmth, and porches provided modest shelter at the entrance. Foundations of fieldstone kept interiors dry, while cellars stored potatoes, apples, and preserves through winter months. Inside, rooms were furnished plainly. A central stove or hearth provided heat and a place for cooking, its iron surface polished by frequent use. Tables bore the marks of knives and labor, while chairs were sturdy rather than ornate. Beds were fitted with straw or feather mattresses, and quilts, often pieced by hand, served both warmth and decoration. Shelves held well-used books, commonly a Bible, a hymnal, and a few volumes of instruction or reference, their pages turned slowly in the evenings. The work of the household was constant and shared. Women managed cooking, washing, and sewing, while also tending gardens and poultry. Men attended to livestock repairs and fieldwork, though tasks shifted as need required. Children were expected to contribute according to age, carrying water, gathering fuel, or assisting with smaller chores. These routines were learned through observation and repetition, becoming habits that required little instruction. Meals were taken at regular hours, their composition shaped by season and circumstance. Bread, often baked weekly, formed the foundation, accompanied by butter, cheese, and preserved meats. Fresh produce appeared when available, while winter fare relied upon stores laid by in autumn. Eating was unhurried, conversation modest, and waste avoided. Such habits, though rarely remarked upon, reflected a careful economy suited to both necessity and custom. Clothing was likewise managed with care. Garments were made to last, mended repeatedly, and adapted as children grew. Wool and linen were common, their textures familiar to the hand. Washing days were laborious affairs, involving kettles, tubs, and lines strung outdoors when weather permitted. Such work occupied entire days, its completion bringing a quiet satisfaction shared among household members. In town, dwellings followed similar patterns, though space was more confined and proximity altered daily rhythms. Families lived nearer one another, sharing walls or narrow yards, and the sounds of neighboring activity were more present. Yet even here, domestic order was maintained, and interiors reflected the same emphasis on durability and usefulness. Shops and workshops were often attached or nearby, blurring the boundary between home and work. Evenings were times of relative stillness. Lamps were lit, their glow soft and steady, and families gathered for reading or conversation. Handwork occupied many hands, while stories were exchanged, often recalling earlier years or distant places. These moments, though quiet, reinforced bonds and transmitted memory, carrying forward knowledge of family and place. Household goods reflected both local production and wider trade. Furniture was often made by local craftsmen, sturdy and restrained in design, while finer items arrived through the harbor or by wagon from inland towns. Crockery, tools, and textiles bore marks of use rather than display, their value measured by service rendered rather than appearance. As night deepened, homes settled into rest. Fires were banked, doors secured, and the sounds of the day receded. Outside, the county lay quiet, its houses darkened, one by one. Within these walls, lives continued in patterns familiar and enduring, shaped by necessity, tradition, and the steady passage of time. Thus, domestic life in Milwaukee County provided the foundation upon which all other activity rested. It was here that labor was sustained, values reinforced, and memory preserved, not in grand gestures, but in daily acts repeated without remark. These homes, modest and enduring, formed the true interior of the county's history. Across Milwaukee County, movement was slow, deliberate, and shaped by the condition of the ground beneath the wheels. Roads were the county's quiet arteries, carrying people, goods, and news between farm, village, and town. They were seldom remarked upon in celebratory language, yet they occupied a steady place in township minutes and county reports, where their maintenance was treated as a matter of shared responsibility and common sense. Most roads followed section lines laid out by survey, their straight courses softened by the land's natural rises and low places. In fair weather, they were firm enough, their surfaces packed by repeated use, but in spring they became heavy with mud, and in autumn they softened again under rain. Travelers learned patience early, allowing extra time for journeys and accepting delay as part of ordinary life. Distance was felt not merely in miles, but in effort, weather, and daylight. Wagons were the most common conveyance, their forms varying according to purpose. Farm wagons carried produce, lumber, and supplies, while lighter rigs served families traveling to church or market. Horses moved at a steady pace, accustomed to the routes and their regular stops. Teamsters knew each rise and hollow, each place where water collected or frost lingered, adjusting their handling accordingly. Such knowledge was passed quietly, learned through repetition rather than instruction. Bridges were few and valued. Where streams crossed roads, travelers often forded them, choosing shallow places known locally and approached with caution after heavy rain. Wooden bridges, when built, required frequent repair, and their condition was noted in township records. These crossings were points of attention, for they could delay travel or, when impassable, isolate households temporarily from their neighbors. Season altered movement profoundly. Winter transformed roads into firm, smooth tracks, making sleigh travel easier than wheeled transport. Bells on harnesses announced approaching teams, their sound carrying across fields in the still air. Journeys that were arduous in spring became almost effortless in snow, and families planned visits and hauling accordingly. Summer, by contrast, brought dust, raised by passing wheels and settling on hedges and fences. Travel served both necessity and connection. Farmers brought goods to town, returning with supplies not produced at home. Children traveled to school, sometimes walking considerable distances, their routes familiar and repeated daily. Ministers, doctors, and merchants moved between communities, their presence anticipated and remembered. In this way, roads sustained the county's social fabric, linking scattered households into a functioning whole. The lakeshore offered another avenue of movement. Roads leading toward the harbor carried produce and passengers to vessels bound for other ports. For many residents, the sight of ships departing was a reminder of broader connections, even if their own travels rarely extended far beyond the county line. Yet the possibility of movement remained, embodied in these routes that pointed outward as well as inward. As evening approached, travel diminished. Wagons returned home, animals were unhitched, and roads grew quiet. Footsteps and wheels gave way to wind, and the distant sounds of farm life settling into rest. The county, crossed by many paths, paused together, each household returning to its own familiar place. Roads were never merely physical features. They represented intention and cooperation, for each mile required agreement, labor, and upkeep. Through them, Milwaukee County became navigable and connected, its parts drawn together not by speed, but by regularity. Movement remained measured, allowing time for observation, conversation, and reflection. In this measured movement lay a kind of balance. Life advanced, yet it did so without haste, each journey undertaken with awareness of distance and condition. The roads bore witness to this rhythm, holding the marks of countless passages, each one modest, each contributing to the larger pattern of shared life. Thus, through road and track, sleigh path and bridge, the county sustained its internal motion. These ways carried not only goods and people, but habit and memory, linking past journeys with those yet to come. They remained quiet witnesses, enduring beneath wheel and hoof, season after season. In Milwaukee County, time was felt less by the turning of pages than by the steady procession of seasons. The year advanced through familiar stages, each announcing itself through changes in air, light, and labor. These transitions were noted in almanacs and diaries alike, yet they required no record to be understood, for they were written plainly upon the land and in the habits of those who lived upon it. Spring arrived with deliberation. Snow withdrew from fields and roads, leaving the ground heavy with moisture and marked by last winter's passage. Streams swelled with meltwater, their banks softened and renewed. Farmers watched the soil closely, judging when it might bear the plow without compaction. The first tasks of the season were humble ones: fence repair, tool mending, and the clearing of debris carried by ice and wind. Birds returned in measured numbers, their calls marking mornings that grew steadily brighter. Summer followed with its own settled authority, fields filled with growing crops, their color deepening as weeks passed. Days lengthened, allowing labor from early morning until evening, and work proceeded according to a rhythm understood by all. Haying required cooperation and fair weather, while planting and cultivation demanded attention to timing and condition. Heat was moderated near the lake, where breezes tempered the sun's strength, yet inland the air could grow heavy, slowing movement and encouraging rest at midday. Autumn was the most deliberate of seasons. Harvest drew together the efforts of many months, and its progress was watched with care. Grain was cut, bound, and threshed, while root crops were lifted and stored. Trees along roads and fields took on subdued color, their leaves falling gradually rather than all at once. Smoke from burning stubble and cooking fires carried farther in the cooler air, lending the countryside a scent both familiar and fleeting. Winter settled last, transforming the county with quiet thoroughness. Snow-covered fields, smoothing their lines and reducing the landscape to essentials. Rivers slowed beneath ice, and roads became firm tracks suitable for sleighs. Work shifted indoors toward maintenance, study, and planning for the year ahead. Evenings lengthened, encouraging reading and conversation, while the outside world rested under cold and stars. Storms arrived with little warning, yet their patterns were familiar, and preparations were made accordingly. Weather was spoken of often, not as idle talk, but as necessary exchange. Its influence touched every aspect of life, from planting to travel to health. Records mention drought and flood, early frost and heavy snow, each event marking a year and shaping memory. Yet these variations were accepted as part of a larger continuity, not as interruption, but as reminder of dependence upon forces beyond control. The lake exerted its own influence upon these cycles. Its presence moderated extremes and introduced its own forms of weather: fog rolling inland, sudden winds rising without warning. Those who lived near the shore learned to read its surface, judging change by color and motion. Inland, its effects were felt more subtly, in delayed frosts and tempered heat. The passage of time was thus marked by return as much as by progress. Each season brought familiar tasks and sensations, reinforcing a sense of continuity. Births, marriages, and deaths were recorded within this framework, their timing often remembered in relation to harvests or storms. Life unfolded within the boundaries set by weather and light, its pace steady rather than hurried. As years passed, small changes accumulated. Fields expanded, buildings improved, and customs adapted, yet the essential pattern remained. The seasons returned, and with them the work and rest that defined the county's rhythm. In this repetition lay reassurance, a sense that life, though shaped by effort, moved within a larger and dependable order. Thus, time in Milwaukee County was neither rushed nor resisted. It was observed, accommodated, and quietly respected. Through season after season, the land and its people advanced together, each shaping the other in ways both visible and understated. The county, taken as a whole, was neither defined by haste nor by isolation. Its farms, towns, and waterways formed a connected fabric, each part sustaining the others through steady exchange. Grain moved from field to mill, flour from mill to harbor, and goods returned along the same routes, carried by wagon and sleigh. These movements were modest in scale, yet constant, giving the county its sense of purpose and cohesion. Families lived within this pattern with an awareness of continuity. Surnames recorded in early schedules appeared again in later volumes, sometimes shifted in spelling, sometimes extended through marriage and migration, yet still rooted in familiar ground. The Bowers and Schmidts along the Menominee, the Johnsons and Larsons in northern fields, the Kowalskis and Zielinskis in southern dairying districts, all contributed in their own measured ways, their lives intersecting through market, church, and road. Change did occur, as it always had. Buildings were replaced, methods refined, and boundaries adjusted. Yet these alterations were absorbed into an existing order rather than overturning it. The county's character rested in its capacity to adapt without forgetting, to improve while remaining recognizable to those who had known it earlier. Public life and private life moved in parallel. Courts and schools, churches and homes, each maintained their own rhythms, intersecting at familiar points. A farmer attending court in town, a child walking to school along a frozen road, a miller waiting upon the river's flow, all participated in a shared understanding of time and obligation. This understanding required little articulation, for it was reinforced daily through practice. As evening settled across the county, the distinctions between its parts softened. The harbor quieted, fields darkened, and roads emptied. Lamps were lit, prayers said, and rest taken where it could be found. In these hours, the county revealed its most enduring aspect, a collective pause that acknowledged both labor completed and labor yet to come. Memory lingered. not only in records, but in landscape. Roads followed paths, first marked by necessity. Fields bore the lines of earlier clearing, and riverbanks held the sites of mills long silent. Even where structures had vanished, their presence was recalled through use and story, passed quietly from one generation to the next. In this way, Milwaukee County endured as more than a jurisdiction or map designation. It existed as a lived environment, shaped by countless ordinary decisions made in kitchens, fields, and workshops. Its history was composed not of singular events, but of accumulated days, each resembling the last closely enough to create stability, yet differing just enough to allow growth. To look back upon such a place was not to search for drama, but to observe balance, land and water, work and rest, movement and stillness, each held their place. The county's story unfolded without urgency, inviting attention rather than demanding it. It rewarded patience, much as the land itself had done for those who tended it. Thus, the entry drew to its natural close. The rivers continued their course, the lake held its horizon, and the fields rested between seasons. What had been built endured where it was needed, and what was no longer required returned quietly to the ground. In such stillness, history found its proper repose, neither forgotten nor overstated, but held gently in memory and place alike. The county remained, as it always had, a meeting of natural form and human care, sustained through quiet continuity. And thus, we close the entry for Milwaukee County, Wisconsin. Rest well.